Welcome to another video from ExplainingComputers.com. This time it's an extended episode in which I'm going to show you how to start building 3D objects in Blender. Specifically, we'll begin with a 12-minute segment that will introduce the interface and some key modelling tools. And then we'll move on to build a precise, specific object based on this drawing. For over 30 years, I've been building 3D objects in different 3D modelling packages. Everything from bioprinters to space-based solar power stations, characters to all kinds of computers and computer parts. And one thing I've discovered is if you want to learn a particular 3D modelling package or a part of it, the best way to do it is to set yourself the goal of building something quite specific. So, let's go and get started. Blender is available for Windows, Mac and Linux and free to download from blender.org. For this tutorial I've installed a clean copy of Blender 3.4.1, so if we run it up, I've got it on my desktop over here, and as this is the first run, it's given us a quick setup where you might want to change the spacebar function from play to tools, which can make it easier to do modelling. And after that we'll click on next, and I'll click again to get rid of the splash screen. And to give us maximum screen estate, I'm also going to go up here to window, and I'm going to toggle window full screen. Now, as we can see, our default view here is called layout. There are lots of different workspaces available, but for now we'll stick in layout, which, like all the workspaces, is divided into a number of areas, which can be configured as we wish. So for example, if I go over to the boundary between these two areas and I click and drag, I can change the size. If we hover over the top left corner of an area, we can also see its editor type, which here is 3D viewport. Down the bottom here, we've got a timeline area. That is not something we really need for modelling purposes. Let's just push it down there for a second. And then up here we've got an outliner, and this shows us all of the different items in our scene, which are a light, a camera, you can see it highlighted there in the viewport, and also a cube, which we're going to be working with in a second. And then our final area here is properties. We can see that if we hover over that, there we are, it's called properties. And this is showing some information on the cube selected in the 3D viewport. And it's worth being aware that any area can be set to any editor type. So for example, I could go up here and we could change this to be preferences like that. And there's lots and lots of preferences available, all sorts of things you can control in Blender. It's great for that. And one of the ones I really like is the fact we can change the resolution scale of the interface. I can drag there and look, every piece of software in the world should be able to do that, shouldn't it? But they can't, but Blender can. Let's leave it on about 1.25, a little big for normal use, but good for making things clear in a video. But with everything okay here, I'm going to set this back to be properties. And I would point out we could have gone to preferences by another means. We could have gone up to edit and preferences like that. You will find in Blender there's always lots of different ways to do the same thing. Anyway, let's now turn our attention to the 3D viewport. And here by default on the top right edge we have this, which is an interactive navigation tool. And if I click and drag in there, you can see we can rotate our view like that, which is very good. And if we move down a bit, we've got a zoom tool. If I click and drag on there, we can zoom in and out on the display. Below that we can move things around, as you can see. And then below that we've got a toggle to show the view from the camera in the scene like that. We'll be using this if we're doing rendering in this video. We're not doing rendering, this is a modelling tutorial, so we'll go back to a normal view. And then finally down here we can toggle between a perspective and an orthographic projection like that. It's also worth noting we can also control our view using a mouse or a trackpad. If using a mouse, we can zoom in and out using the wheel on the mouse like that. I'm using my mouse wheel to go in and out like that. And if we want to rotate our view, if you hold down the wheel on the mouse like that and move around, I can rotate the view. If we want to move the view, if I hold down Shift and hold down the mouse wheel, the middle mouse button, I can move again, move around like that. And if we're using a laptop, we can do a similar thing. Specifically, whilst moving one finger on the trackpad controls the mouse, moving two fingers together rotates the 3D view. whilst holding down Shift and moving two fingers moves the view. And if we hold two fingers on the trackpad and move them together or apart, we can zoom. So it's perfectly possible to use a laptop for modelling in Blender. Now, having learned how to move around in our viewport, let's manipulate this exciting cube. And we can do this using the tools on the toolbar over here. And as you may have noticed, some of these tools have got a very small arrow on their bottom right. And on those tools, if we click and hold, we can see we can select different tools from the same icon. Here, for example, select box, select circle, or select lasso, although we'll leave that on select box. And of course, we use that for selecting an object like that. Moving down, we have got the 3D cursor, which I'm not going to cover in this video. So let's move down again to move, which, as I'm sure you would guess, is for moving things around. And we can either drag on a particular axis like this, or if we move our pointer to the middle of this circle, we can go in all directions at the same time. And what I'm going to do here is to press Ctrl-Z to bring things back to where they were. Moving down, we've got rotate. I'm sure you would guess this rotates. Again, if we click in the middle, we can go in all directions at once, which normally isn't very helpful. It's normally more useful to use a particular axis like that. And it's even more useful to hold down the Control key and to use an axis and drag. And with the Control key held down, we're working in 5-degree increments, because often we want to do a 90-degree rotation, things like that. Next down, let's select it again. We have got scale, and if we click inside the circle, we can scale in proportion by dragging and holding like that, make it very, very large or very, very small, depending on what we want to do. Bring it back that size, I think. And we can also use the handles to scale in a particular axis. And then finally, I want to put it back to normal again. Down here, we've got transform, which gives us all the tools together. So we can do a bit of moving and a bit of rotating and a bit of scaling, all with the same tool, which gives me more things to undo. Oh, and there's another tool. Let's just select this again. And that other tool we access by the keyboard. And if I press the G on the keyboard for grab, this happens. You'll see the color changes and our cursor changes. And if I move my mouse, I'm not clicking and dragging here, I'm just dragging. And if I now click, we put the object in a new location. Let's do that again. I press G on the keyboard, nothing happened with the mouse. Now move the mouse, click, and we've grabbed and moved the object. Although again, we'll put it back where we started. And this gets us into the subject of keyboard shortcuts. And there are loads and loads and loads and loads of keyboard shortcuts in Blender. So for example, you can access anything in a toolbar using a keyboard shortcut. And to do that, by default in Blender, to access the toolbar, you would press Shift and the spacebar. But you might remember on our first boot, we told Blender to use the spacebar directly for tools. So here, if I press the spacebar like this, it brings up a menu, and I could select something like that to say get to rotate, or I could do spacebar and, for example, B to get back to select, spacebar and T to get to transform, things like that. And many people will tell you, learn the keyboard shortcuts straight away in Blender. And that's good advice to a certain extent. But because there's so many of them, I would suggest just learn a few, and I'll give you a few more in this video. But initially, to keep things simple as you learn, just click on the toolbar icons. And in this video, that's what I'm going to be doing, so you can clearly see what's going on. Now, so far what we've been doing has been manipulating this cube in terms of rotating it, sizing it, moving it around. That's exciting, but we haven't been changing its geometry. And that's because we're in what's called object mode. But if we use this top left menu and we select edit mode, we go into, well, edit mode, where we can change the geometry of an object. And there's a very useful keyboard shortcut for this. I told you I'll be coming back to keyboard shortcuts, and that's the tab key. If I press tab, we can flick between object mode, object mode, or edit mode. You can have endless fun just flicking between the two using the tab key. And what happens here in edit mode is we can work with either what's called a vertex, which is a point on the object, or we can manipulate an edge, or we can manipulate individual faces or polygons of the object. And if we start with vertexes, let's select one vertex like that and go, for example, to move. I could now pull that point around like that. And you've got to be slightly careful doing this, because if we just rotate this view, you'll see we've now got a 4-point polygon, which clearly isn't flat. In other words, we've created what's called illegal geometry. We can do this on screen in a 3D package, but this wouldn't render properly. You certainly couldn't 3D print an object with illegal geometry. And so you've got to be a little bit careful when moving around individual points, although it's also often a critical thing to be able to do. We can also manipulate edges. Let's select an edge like that and move the edge. There we are. We're making, oh, it's a Java Sandcrawler. R2-D2 is being sold down there. Possibly. You never know. Let's Ctrl-Z out of that. And let's also pick a face like that. We could pick, say, the top face, move it down. We've made our cube slightly thinner. Let's move on and use another tool. And there's lots of tools down here. If I just scroll down, if I can get the right place to grab the scroll bar, there they are. Because I've got a large scale factor here, they've gone off the screen. So what I'm going to do is just to go like that and pull across, and they all fit on the screen, which is very handy. And the tool I want to show you is this one, a very handy tool called Loop Cut. And if I go across to the object like this, you'll see it puts a cut through the object in the 3 possible planes, depending on where I put the mouse. I want to cut in this plane. And what I'm going to do is to hold down the mouse. I've not released it yet, and I can now drag that cut to where I want it on the object. Let's leave it about there. And you'll see the tool now remains active. It wants us to do another one because it's a very excitable tool. Blender doesn't put down its tools until you select another. And what I now want to do is to select a face. We're going to select that face there, and we're going to go to another very useful tool called the Extrude tool over there. And you can guess what this does. Let's pull this up. There we are. We've extruded part of this object. We're building a kind of a little bracket. It's very exciting indeed. And what I think we'll now do, I'm just repositioning this in anticipation of exciting things to come, is I'm now going to show you the bevel tool. And for this, I'm going to select an edge. Let's select that edge there like that. And then we'll now go to bevel over here like that. A handle comes up, and if we drag it, we bevel that edge of the object. Isn't that exciting? And as the tool has been activated, we can now see a call out down here, as you see with all tools. And if I click on that, we get to controls for this particular tool. Where here, for example, we could increase the number of segments, add a bit more geometry in like that. We could change the width. You can set things accurately by typing values in if you want as well. This really is very powerful indeed. We've done a nice little bevel. And we can also bevel lots of edges at the same time. Let's just rotate around something like that, I think. Isn't it fun moving around in 3D space in Blender? And what I'm going to do is to select this edge at the top, hold down the Shift key so I can select multiple edges, and then select another edge, and another edge, and another edge like that. And then we'll drag the little thing like that. And again, move it out of the way so we can see where we're going to have our controls. And we'll add a few more segments like that, I think, as well. And again, we'll make it slightly bigger like that. There we are. I think that's a good place to leave this particular object. And if I press Tab, we go back to object mode, where we can take a look at the masterpiece we have created. Isn't that exciting? And so now it's time to move on to build something specific with exact measurements. And in the process, we're also going to learn more about the Blender interface. Right, we're now going to build the bracket that I've sketched out with dimensions in this drawing, and which bolts 2 connectors and a switch to the end of this breadboard. So, over in Blender, in a new scene, I thought we'd start out by deleting everything. I'll get rid of that cube, I'll select the light, get rid of that, and the camera. We don't need those for our modeling purposes. So we've got a completely blank workspace, and what we'll now do is to start adding things in. So I'm going to add a mesh, and it's going to be a cube. I just got rid of a cube, but I wanted to show you how I could add one in, so we'll go into cube like that. And the call out for cube down here is useful. It allows us to change various things, but it doesn't allow us to set different sizes for the different edges of the cube, because I guess it's a cube. So what we have to do is to press the N key on the keyboard like that to bring up the transform plane, where I can enter some specific dimensions, which are going to be 63.5 millimeters by 14 millimeters by 7 millimeters for the base of the bracket like that. And you're probably thinking, that's a bit small, Chris, but do not panic. I'm going to do this. I have pressed here the / key, and what that does is to go to view and to frame selected, as you can see from the menu, although pressing / is quicker. And I'll also press the N key again to get rid of the transform panel. And before we start working on this object, I think we'll do a little bit of reconfiguration of our workspace. And to let you know about one potentially very useful keyboard shortcut, if you press Ctrl and the spacebar, you maximize the current area. That can be very handy. And do note that that depends on where you are on the screen. If we're over here in this area, that one would maximize. Over here would do the 3D viewport. And here in the viewport, we can have lots of different views. And one way of selecting them is to press the tilde key, the one just below the escape key. If I press that, we can select a view. So I can select, for example, top view. I often find that very handy. We can get out of a view like this, going up to the gizmo over here and rotating it. That takes us back to a perspective view. And if we want to, we can also get to the different views by clicking on the axis up here in the gizmo, although personally I prefer to press tilde and do views like that. Although for most of this modelling, I'm actually going to work in what's called a quad view. So I'm going to hold down Ctrl, Alt and press the Q key, and here we are, we can see 4 different views of the object for standard 3 projections and a 3D view. But the strange thing here is if I move around in one of these quad views or I actually zoom in, it doesn't stay in sync with the other views, which would drive me absolutely crazy. But we can fix this. We can press the N key again to go to the transform panel, go down to view, scroll right to the bottom, open up quad view. It's hiding down here. And here we have to have lock rotation ticked, which it is by default, but also sync zoom pan like that. I'll press N to get rid of that panel. And now if I move around here, you'll see our quad views are linked together, which makes things much better. And you can probably notice we've got a grid here, and the resolution of the grid changes as we zoom in. If I zoom in like that, you can see this is working at a millimeter resolution. That's very handy for what we're doing here. Although we can't see the grid through things here, so what I'm going to do is to work largely in wireframe mode, going up to the top here, changing the shading to wireframe rather than solid. We'll stick in wireframe. And note that for all views, we can use this control to turn off what's called X-ray mode. So with X-ray mode on, we see all geometry. With it off, we only see front faces. And it's worth noting there's a keyboard shortcut for this. It is Alt-Z. If I try it like that, it toggles back and forth. That's very handy because if we go here into edit mode, you can't see the controls for X-ray mode, but we can still use Alt-Z to turn them on and off. And I'll come back into object mode for now. I'm also going to go across here to the properties pane and go to scene properties, where I'm going to change units to be in millimeters. It won't change any sizes here. It just means when we display things, it'll be millimeters rather than meters. If I bring up the transform pane again, as you can see, this is now in millimeters. Our object has got exactly the same dimensions, but expressed with millimeters against them. So we'll close that one off and also put that back over there. And if I deselect the object by clicking somewhere else, you'll see it's displayed with black lines on a dark grey background. And I don't find that very helpful. So what I'm going to do over here is to go to the preferences, like we saw in the last segment of the video, go to themes and go to 3D viewport like this. And down here, we can set the colors. So I'm going to set a wireframe to a whitish color, something like that. I'll get there eventually. And I'm going to set wire edit to a bluish color for reasons I'll explain in a second. That blue I think will be okay. And if we just go back over there now, we've now got a far clearer display of the object on the screen when things aren't selected, as we can see. And if we go into edit mode, if we deselect that, it's now in blue. But if I, for example, tried to select a vertex, we'd select a vertex in white, which is why I didn't want that in white. It has to be in a contrasting color. Anyway, I find it very handy to make these color changes. And I'm also going to go up here to the overlays and turn off the display of the 3D cursor because it just drives me insane. And in fact, I think I'm also going to go back again. We'll also turn off here the text information given our scaling. We don't want to have our screen too cluttered. Oh, and whilst we're talking about interface, it's worth telling you if you want to get rid of a toolbar, you can press T to turn the toolbar on and off. That can be rather handy. And as usual in Blender, we're getting wound up in the interface, but the last thing I want to say about the interface is we have our different workspaces at the top. We're currently using the one called layout. There's one called modeling. We could be doing our work in modeling. Let's just zoom the object up. It opens in edit mode the modeling workspace, but we can change it like that. I think we'll keep this as a nice 3D view, and we'll use a layout for most of our building. Oh, and if you're wondering, making changes to these workspaces, and you can use any one you like, it really doesn't matter what you do with them. They're simply labeled areas. They haven't got a particular function regardless of the labels at the top. But whatever changes we make here will be saved with our file. So if we just show that, let's just save this file. Let's call it bracket, like that. And if I bring in a file I've actually been working on separately over there, you'll see it comes in with its own settings. I've actually changed the name of the workspaces at the top here. I've got a detail one, 3D view one. I find it easy to flick back and forth using these views. And it is worth pointing out that in Blender, you can split different areas. If I go down to the base of this area like this, so I get the arrow, I right click, I could do say a vertical split here, like that. We've now got two views, we could move around like that. Some people like to work in different views like that. But personally, I find it much easier to work with a quad view and going across to some full screen views like this one once was. If you want to put it back again, go across to the join and join areas. You'd probably have guessed that, to put things back as they were. Anyway, we're now in entirely the wrong object, so let's just go back into what we were working on, which is our bracket over there. Do we want to save this? No, we don't. And we'll now set about transforming this piece of geometry into our final object. And to do that, we'll go into edit mode. I could use the tab key. I tend to do either of them. We'll pull out our tools as we did in the last segment so we can see them nicely. And we're going to select our loop cut. And we'll put a loop cut in here. We want it across that way. Come on, Blender, give me that direction. Doesn't want to play. There we are. Sometimes you have to, no, that way, there we are. That's where we want it. Excellent. And we'll do it like that. And in fact, we'll move it around individually after that because I need it in exactly the right place. And to put it in exactly the right place, what I'm going to do is to go to snapping. I'll turn on snapping, my little magnet up there. We'll go to the snapping settings and we'll select absolute grid snap. It'll snap to the grid. So if we now pull this around, it's snapping to our 1mm grid. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's down 4mm. That's now in the right place. Next, we're going to do an extrude of the plane at the back. We'll select the face like that. And to select our face easily here, I'm going to go into an Alt-Z to go turn off X-ray mode so we can select easily. We'll then come back again. We'll now do our extrude. We'll pull up the region like that. Although I want to set an exact distance, so I'll use the call out. I know it needs to be 37 millimeters. I don't need to put the millimeters in now, do I? I set the measurements, but I'll do it anyway. It keeps me amused like that. And our object is now starting to look a little bit like the one in the drawing. Except that in the drawing, the front edges here are curved, so we will sort that out. We will go and select that vertex like that, and that vertex, hold down Shift like that. And guess what? We're going to use bevel. And it isn't going to work properly, at least initially. So let's click on bevel, and we can pull out the handle, but if we do, doesn't look quite right, does it? Go away a second. And if we just move across, you'll see the bevel is not even on each side. And if we do in fact look at the call out, it thinks it's 257 millimeters, that bevel, which is strange given the whole object is 63.5 millimeters across. Something is clearly going wrong. So what can we do about this? Well, the first thing we're going to do is to press Ctrl-Z to get rid of that. And we'll go back into object mode, and I'm going to select the object and bring up our transform panel, where we can see the size really is 63 millimeters across, but it isn't really, because what's going on here is that Blender created a cube which was much bigger and applied some scale factors on the different axes, and that's what's throwing off our bevel. So what we need to do is to go across from that panel and press Ctrl-A and apply the transformations that are giving us the problems. I'm going to apply all transformations, can't go wrong doing that. And we can now see the scale is correct. So we turn off that panel, I'll tab back into edit mode, pull out our bevel again, and that looks much better, doesn't it? I know it actually wants to be a 2mm bevel, and it needs to have a few more segments, say 9 segments. Let's make it nice and rounded. There we are. We've got our bevel correctly on the front of the object. And in general, if you're working on objects and transforming them, it's best to go to Ctrl-A and apply the transformation as soon as you can. But I wanted to show you here what happens if you don't do it. Now, the next thing we want to do is to add a couple of holes in our object to take some bolts at the front. So to do that, I'm going to go back into object mode, and we're going to add in a mesh, which is going to be a cylinder. And when you add a cylinder, the call out is very useful. It gives you all the things you need. We can make it say 24 vertices, doesn't have to have a lot of geometry. For this, it's going to be a tiny hole. I think the actual diameter is 3.5, and that's going to be over 2 for the radius. So there we are, it'll do the maths for us. We'll make it say 10 millimeters tall, that'll be ample. And there we are, you can see we've got our cylinder down here. And what we need to do is to move it into the right place. Just click to get rid of that call out down there. And what I think I'm going to do is to go Ctrl-Alt-q to come out of our quad view, and then I'll also use the tilde key to select a top view like that. And we'll zoom in a little bit to give ourselves a bit of space to work in a nice controlled way. And so I'll now select the cylinder, and it needs to be down this bottom corner, and it needs to be positioned so there is exactly 56.5 millimeters between the two holes we're going to put in. And to achieve that, I'm going to add in a mesh, which is going to be a cube. It's going to be just a guide for us, and I'm going to make that of 56.5 millimeters. And if I now go up to snapping, and I turn snapping away from being absolute grid snap to edge snap, and we snap to the center of our object. If we now just select our cylinder over there, and if we drag it across, it should snap, there it does, into exactly the right place on that edge. And to get our second hole, I'm going to press Shift-D to duplicate, and you'll see we've now got another one attached to our edge. And it's moving all over the place. How can we stop that? Well, if we press X, it'll be constrained to the X axis. So we can just drag it across, it'll snap again, and there we are, press to finish, and we've duplicated an object in the right place. And what I'll now do is select both of the cylinders, that one there and this one over here. And I'm going to join them together. I can do that by doing right click and selecting join, although normally you just use Ctrl-J, but I thought I'd show you the menu. And I think we'll now do a little bit of naming to make things nice and clear. I'm going to call this base holes, I think like that. And we'll also call the cube up here, oh, it's moved, we'll call the cube, the main cube, this is going to be called bracket, that's the thing we're building. And the other cube was just a guide, that can be deleted like that. And I've also just noticed I've left this set on preferences, which we don't want. Let's put this back to, I can go in the right place. I'm going all over the place. We'll set this back to properties so we can see object properties. We're going to need that in a second. And I'm also going to go back to our quad view like that, because that's really where we want to be. And what we want to be doing now is to turn our cylinders into holes in the main object. How do we do that? Well, we've got the main object selected, as you can see, it's nice and orange. And if we go down here, we can go to modifiers, and we're going to add a modifier. And the particular modifier is going to be called a Boolean. And there's three types of Boolean: intersection, union, and what is called here bizarrely different, but which actually means subtraction. It even says it's subtraction, and we can subtract another object. So we'll use a little dropper tool there to select the other object. I'm sure you're ahead of me now. We can select the cylinders, and it has taken them away. And what we'll do is we'll actually stop them being displayed on the screen. We'll just send them to sleep like that. And we can now see that beautifully we've got, let's just, well, we rotate around a bit like that. We can see those holes in the object. We go across over here, we can probably see them over here. Or we can't. Why not? The reason is over here, we're in edit mode. If we were in object mode, we would see them, but we can see things in edit mode if we want. We can go across to our Boolean over here, and we can make it auto display in edit mode. Phew, we can see them over there as well. Anyway, we'll go back over here because actually those holes aren't in exactly the right place. So I'm going to turn them on again because I didn't move them down to the base corner. So we'll do that. We'll pick up the holes. We will zoom in quite a lot. We'll move across like that. And I'm going to manually put them in place. I think I can't be bothered to do a thing because I'm sure I can do it by eye accurately enough. These are 1 millimeter holes after all, so we can pull that down to be about there. That will work. And note, as we've done that, the Boolean has moved around. It's very clever. We can move an object which is being applied as a Boolean, and it's actually moving around the position of the hole. That, I think, is a rather clever thing you can do in Blender. But we'll turn them off again for now so we can't see them, because of course there are more things we need to add. If we look back to the drawing, let's just select the object and put it roughly back in the right place with a couple of presses of the / key like that. If we look at the drawing, we can see we've got some extra cutouts at the front, so I'm now going to build those. There we are. I've got some rounded cornered cubes in place for these cuts. And what we could do here is to go back to our bracket, and we could add in another modifier. We could add in another Boolean. We could add in Boolean 2 if you like this, and we could select obviously these objects like that, and they would give us the cuts, and we could turn them off like this, the front inlays. You can see that would work. You can see what's been going on there if we look at things like that. However, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm actually not going to add in this second boolean at all. I'm going to get rid of that, and we'll turn our undays back on for a second, because what I'm going to do is a little bit neater than that. Let's give ourselves a bit more space over here. I'm going to add what's called a collection. I'm going to call this collection all cuts, like that. And what I'm going to do is go back to the original boolean and change it from being from an object to a collection, just a collection of different parts like that. And we're going to select the collection. It's going to be all cuts. You're probably again ahead of me. And now what we can do up here is we can take the base holes and add them into all cuts, and we can take the front inlays, also add them into all cuts like that. And of course they can also be invisible. And there we are. We've just got one group controlling all the cuts in the object. We're going to have a look at it. It's starting to build up, isn't it? I always like the way that objects start out being very simple, and then they slowly get more and more sophisticated. Those are rather nice little corners. Anyway, there are more cuts to go, so I'll build a little bit more. There we go, 5 cylinders have been added, and they were added when we were already working in the all cuts collection, so they've already been booleaned from the object. Let's go across to, let's just turn them off actually for a second, we can see what's going on. They are cuts, not quite in the right place yet. We can see things are happening, very exciting as normal. We can see what is going on with our object. Just need to move them into exactly the right position, so we'll turn them on so we can do that. Pick up the object like that, and I think we can do that over in this view reasonably enough. Not that difficult to work out where they need to go. They just need to go up a bit like this, or we need to turn off our snapping. There we go, let's turn off snapping. This is very much a position by eye, and if we just move this up like that, move it across like this. Blender's obviously doing some work because it's having to work out the boolean as we're doing this. But I think that's roughly where we need to be. Yes, that looks about right. One of these things where some of the dimensions are critical, some of the dimensions aren't critical. Obviously things have to be the correct distances apart in terms of holes and things, but other than that, that seems to be okay. Let's turn those off. Yes, there we are. We've now got those holes in the object. This is coming on very nicely indeed. So finally, we need to make a cutout to take our VGA connector over here. So I'll get on with that. I'm going to build it from a couple more cubes, and I think I'll make my life easy by turning off the bracket for a second while I get on with that. And there we are, with a little bit of messing around, very much one done by eye as well as measurement there. We've got our VGA hole. It's again sitting in all cuts. We can turn it off so we can't see it. And there we are. We have our final object. Let's just finally come out of quad view for a final time. Let's get rid of a transform panel. Not like that, Christopher, like that. We'll even go back into shaded view over here. In fact, we'll go into shaded view with some wireframe edges. I always think it looks rather nice to see what is going on. There we are. That is our final object. And it looks pretty much like the object I first built and printed as we were looking at earlier. And if you wanted to 3D print this final object, you might want to do that. Note you can go to File and Export as an STL file for 3D printing, but before you do that, you'd need to apply the modifiers, because here there's lots and lots of geometry. We just can't see all of it, but it's still here. So the trick is to save your object as it is. We'll save this as a bracket. There we are, like that. And we could now apply the modifiers. We could go down here to the Boolean, go down to that drop down and apply. And now all cuts is not being used. We've actually changed the geometry. All cuts is still here because of course these objects still exist, but we can now get rid of these. We can delete the collection if we wish to, like that. Delete the holes and the inlays and all that work we've just done. So of course you'd save this as a separate object, but we've now got our final file including the inlays, and we can from that make an STL file. We could export to STL. We could call it bracket STL. It's already there. We've saved our STL file from this Blender 3D object. In this video, we've used some basic but powerful Blender modeling tools, including loop cut, extrusion, bevel, and booleans to build a precise 3D object. And we've also used quite a few keyboard shortcuts, which I thought I'd summarize here, and I'll also list these keyboard shortcuts in the video description. As I'm sure you're aware, many more modelling tools and functions are available in Blender, not least including subdivision surfaces that can be used to generate complex smooth geometry from a more basic mesh. And if this video proves popular, I'm sure I'll cover that and lots of other Blender functionality in future videos. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I hope to talk to you again very soon.